असतो मा सद्गमय तमसो मा ज्योतिर्गमय मृत्योर्मा अमृतं गमय शांति शांति शांति. Today we have assembled here for Swami Lokeswaranananda Memorial Lecture. Before we begin our lecture, a very short life sketch of revered Maharaj. Swami Lokeswarananda ji was one of the most illustrious monks of the Ramakrishna order, revered for his spiritual depth, extraordinary administrative ability, humanitarian vision and scholarly contributions to Vedanta and Indian philosophy. Born as Shivapada Bandyopadhyay with the pet name of Kanai Lal, in present-day Bangladesh he displayed a contemplative and spiritual temperament from his childhood. His mother was Shivvasini Devi and father Vasanta Kumar. Deeply inspired by the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, he gradually turned away from the worldly ambitions and dedicated himself to a life of renunciation and service. He joined the Ramakrishna order in 1933, received initiation from Swami Shivanandaji Maharaj, and later embraced sannyasa under Swami Virajanandaji at Belur Mutt. As a monk, Swami Lokeswaranandaji perfectly embodied the Ramakrishna Vivekananda ideal of combining intense spirituality with active service to humanity. His life was marked by discipline, humility, compassion, and an unshakable faith in the transformative power of education and spiritual values. He believed that service to the poor and suffering was not charity, but worship of the divine present in every individual. This philosophy shaped all his works and institutions. In the early years of his monastic life, he was entrusted with relief and welfare activities in difficult regions, including Burma and rural Bengal. During periods of famine, poverty, and social distress, he worked tirelessly among orphans, slum dwellers, and marginalized communities. His relief work during the Bengal famine and his rehabilitation efforts for underprivileged youth reflected his deep commitment to practical Vedanta, spirituality expressed through selfless action. One of Swami Lokeswarananda's greatest achievements was the transformation of the Ramakrishna Mission Center at Narendrapur near Kolkata into a major educational and social service institution. Beginning with a small students' home and orphanage and destitute boys, he gradually developed the institution into a vast educational complex spread over hundreds of acres. Under his leadership arose schools, residential colleges, vocational training institutes, agricultural and rural development centers, and welfare programs for economically disadvantaged communities. His vision was not merely to impact academic education, but to create complete human beings grounded in morality, discipline, service, and spiritual awareness. A particularly remarkable aspect of his work was his pioneering effort in education for the visually impaired. He founded the Blind Boys Academy at Narendrapur, which became one of India's finest institutions for visually challenged students. He ensured that these students received not only formal education, but also dignity, confidence, vocational training, and opportunities for independent living. His compassion toward the differently abled and socially neglected reflected the universal humanism at the heart of his spiritual philosophy. Swami Lokeswarananda also played a significant role in rural upliftment and mass education. Through initiatives connected with the Ramakrishna Mission Lokashikha Parishad, he promoted literacy, vocational skills, teacher training, and rural self-development programs across villages of West Bengal. He encouraged youth empowerment and self-reliance through technical education and community-based welfare activities. Apart from being a visionary administrator and humanitarian, Swami Lokeswaranandaji was widely respected as a scholar, thinker, and prolific writer. He possessed profound knowledge of Vedanta, the Upanishads, the Indian philosophical traditions, and sought to interpret these timeless teachings in a modern and accessible language. His writings combine intellectual clarity with spiritual insight, making complex philosophical concepts understandable to ordinary readers and students. Among his important literary works are Eternal Wisdom of India, Swami Vivekananda, His Life and Message, and collections of lectures and reminiscences of the direct disciples of Sri Ramakrishna. He also translated and commented upon several major Upanishads, including the Ishopanishad, Kathopanishad, Kenopanishad, and Chandogya Upanishad. Drawing inspirations from the commentaries of Adi Shankaracharya, he explained Vedantic truths with exceptional simplicity and philosophical depth. His writings emphasized harmony of religions, inner spiritual awakening, self-realization, and the divinity inherited in every human being. From 1973 until his passing in 1998, he served as the head of the Ramakrishna Mission Institute of Culture, where he transformed the institution into a globally respected center for cultural dialogue, scholarship, and interfaith understanding. Under his leadership, the institute expanded its library, organized seminars and language programs, and became a meeting ground for scholars, thinkers, and spiritual seekers from around the world. He traveled extensively across Europe, America, Russia, and Asia, delivering lectures on Vedanta, Indian culture, and universal spirituality at prestigious universities and international forums. Swami Lokeswarananda's life remains a luminous example of the synthesis of monkhood, scholarship, education, and humanitarian service. Through his institutions, writings, and spiritual ideals, he inspired generations of students, devotees, scholars, and monks. His legacy continues to live on through the countless lives transformed by his compassion, vision, and dedication to the service of humanity. Today, Swami Lokeswarananda Memorial Lecture will be delivered by Swami Medhananda Ji Maharaj. We all fondly know him as Ayun Maharaj. He will be speaking on Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta, a philosophy of harmony for a divided age. Swami Medhananda Ji Maharaj, an acclaimed philosopher belonging to the Ramakrishna Sangha, is the author of 4 books, Karma and Rebirth in Hinduism, published by Cambridge University Press in 2025. Swami Vivekananda's Vedantic Cosmopolitanism, published by Oxford University Press in 2022. Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, Sri Ramakrishna and Cross-Cultural Philosophy of Religion, published by Oxford University Press in 2018. And the Dialectics of Aesthetic Agency, Reevaluating German Aesthetics from Kant to Adorno, published by Bloomsbury in 2013. He is the editor of the Bloomsbury Research Handbook of Vedanta. He is also the editor of 2 special issues of the International Journal of Hindu Studies, one on Vedantic theodicies and one on Swami Vivekananda as a cosmopolitan thinker. He has published over 30 articles in such journals as Philosophy East and West, Journal of Indian Philosophy, Religious Studies, Journal of Consciousness Studies, the Moinst Kantian Review, Journal of Religion, Journal of World Philosophies, etc. He is currently working on 2 book projects, both under contract with Oxford University Press, and all embracing oneness, Sri Aurobindo's Integral Advaita, and the Legacy of Sri Ramakrishna will be the 3rd book in his Integral Advaita trilogy. He is also editing the book Indian Spirituality in Contemporary Philosophy, to which 15 leading philosophers are contributing. I now request Swami Medhananda Ji to come and deliver his lecture.
Om Sarvadharma Stapakastvam Sarvadharma Swarupakaha Acharyanam Mahacharyo Ramakrishnayate Namaha Ramakrishnayate Namaha. Good evening, everyone. I offer my humble pranams to revered Swami Tattvasaranaji Maharaj and other senior Swamis. And offer my warm namaskars to everyone here in attendance. I'm deeply honored to be delivering this Swami Lokeswaranananda Memorial Lecture, one of the great Swamis of our order, who made such a powerful and lasting contribution to this very institution, the Institute of Culture. I'm humbled that revered Tattvasaranaji invited me to speak on this occasion. One little note, please put your phones on silent, if possible. Thank you. I'll be speaking primarily in English, the language I'm most comfortable with, but since I'm in Kolkata, I'll also occasionally speak Bangla, sometimes a little bit of a mixture. So friends, let's take a time machine together. Let's go back to the year 1842. The young Gadadhar was 6 years old. He was a natural lover of humanities, what in the West is called humanities, what in India is often called the arts. He was a great actor, extremely creative, a singer, a sculptor. He was very good at mimicry also, imitating people's gestures, their behavior. And Swamiji too, Swami Vivekananda, when he was in college, Scottish Church College, what was his major? Philosophy. So both Sri Ramakrishna and Swamiji were great lovers of humanities. And there's an irony in this. Nowadays, in India especially, humanities tends to be looked down upon. Madhyamike kharap korle ki hoy? Art stream e jay. Bhalo korle ki? Science stream. Ami to nije bangali, ami orakomi amar baba ma erokom amake brainwash korechilo. In German, the term for humanities is Geisteswissenschaften. It's a beautiful term, which literally means sciences of the spirit. Sciences of the spirit. That's the deeper meaning of humanities subjects, philosophy, literature, Sanskrit, and so on, history. Because there's a deep connection between humanities subjects and spirituality. It's not a coincidence that Sri Ramakrishna was so gifted in humanities. It's not a coincidence that Swami Vivekananda studied philosophy. And I'm very grateful that long back when I was in college at Berkeley, my dad, he made me enroll as a computer science major. Typical respectable subject for Bengalis. But after a year, I changed my major, thankfully, to philosophy and English literature. And of course, my parents were not happy, but it was the best decision I ever made. Because it's because of that that I'm able to write books on Vedanta, on Sri Ramakrishna, on Swami Vivekananda, these great saints that I love. And because of that, I can also do deep research as a kind of spiritual practice. So now, that was all kind of a detour. But with all that said, in Swami Sharadananda's great biography of Sri Ramakrishna, Leela Prasanga, he makes a general statement about this young Gadadhar's studies at the age of about 6. He said he had a general aversion to arithmetic. He didn't like math. Okay? But what's interesting is, in another text, which is much less widely read, but which should be, Akhoy Kumar Sen's Sri Sri Ramakrishna Puthi. It's a kind of poetic biography of Sri Ramakrishna. It's a beautiful text which Swami Vivekananda himself read, and he praised it to the skies. He wrote in a letter to Shashi Maharaj, Swami Ramakrishna-ji. Swamiji said, "Just now I read Akhoy's book. Give him 100,000 embraces from me. Through his pen, Sri Ramakrishna is manifesting himself. Blessed is Akhoy." Okay. So it's from this text that I want to read to you my very favorite passage. I hope it's on there, yeah. Forgive my pronunciation and so on. Sorry? Terij porjonto onke jare bole jog ar nahi parilen shikite bijog স্বভাবত যোগে মন তাই যোগ হলো অধম বিয়োগ তাহে বুদ্ধি বেঁকে গেল পূর্ণ থেকে পূর্ণ গেলে পূর্ণ থাকে যার কেমনে বিয়োগে বুদ্ধি আসিবে তাহার এ বড় সুগুড় অঙ্ক শাস্ত্রে নাই বুঝিতে এসব তত্ত্ব সৎবুদ্ধি চায় বাদ দিলে পূর্ণ ব্রহ্ম হতে তথাপিও সে পূর্ণ ব্রহ্ম থাকে হাতে. Rough translation. It's a beautiful passage full of literary subtleties and philosophical insights. In arithmetic, Sri Ramakrishna, Gadadhar, advanced only as far as basic addition, but he could not manage to learn subtraction, bijog. Addition, yoga, jog. Addition was in his nature, so it came with ease. Subtraction, bijog, seemed base to him, and thus his progress in learning subtraction took a crooked turn. For one for whom, even when the infinite, the Purnam, is taken from the infinite remains, how could the very idea of subtraction ever enter his mind? This is a most profound arithmetic, unknown to math textbooks. To grasp such truths, one needs a sound, pure, discerning intellect. Subtract the infinite Brahman from the infinite Brahman, and yet that infinite Brahman still remains in hand. My entire talk today will be based on these profound verses, these profound shlokas from Akhoy Kumar Sen's Sri Sri Ramakrishna Puthi. It's so packed with philosophical and literary brilliance. So let's start to unpack it a little bit. I guess it's a little bit small, huh? So, first of all, he's brilliantly punning and kind of playing on the words yoga and viyoga. Yoga means what? Spiritual practice, of course. We all know that, sitting here. But it also means addition. And viyoga means subtraction, bijog, jog or bijog, addition and subtraction. So he's playing on this dual meaning of yoga and then viyoga. So then the line, Shabhavato Joge Mon, how does he read it? It has a double meaning. Sri Ramakrishna's, Gadadhar's mind was always in yoga. But also, addition was in his nature. He could only add, he couldn't subtract. Because he was this great yogi. And then, the verses take a beautiful turn when Akhoy Kumar Sen refers to the great Vedic mantra, which we all know, Purnamadav Purnamidam Purnat Purnamidachyate, that one. From the infinite comes the infinite, so on. When you subtract the infinite from the infinite, what's left? Not zero, the infinite. This is the mathematics of the infinite that Sri Ramakrishna not only taught, but embodied in his own life and demonstrated experientially. So what these verses show from the Punti is that Sri Ramakrishna taught and exemplified a different kind of Advaita philosophy, something that we're not used to. We all know Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. But I think we need to think more deeply, reflect more deeply, more profoundly about the precise nature of Sri Ramakrishna's Advaita philosophy. And these verses from the Punti help us to do so. Because these verses suggest that there are at least two kinds of Advaita philosophy. So we can even call this talk a tale of two Advaitas. What are these two Advaitas? Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, as I'll try to show today, was what we can call a subtraction-based Advaita, a subtraction-based non-dual philosophy. It's grounded in a methodology of subtraction and a realization of subtraction. And Sri Ramakrishna's Advaita philosophy was an addition-based Advaita, an additive Advaita. He subtracts nothing. It's an Advaita that encompasses everything. And he used a very succinct statement in Bangla to encompass his special kind of Advaita philosophy. He said, Shob jodiye ekti. Shob jodiye ekti. Shob jodiye ekti. Don't subtract anything. Don't exclude anything. What does he mean by anything? Jiva, Jagat, Ishvara. This entire world of names and forms. Why subtract these things? They're all the same. They all constitute different aspects, different parts of the same Advaitic truth, the same Advaitic totality. And he used the example of a bale fruit. Bichi bad dille, ojun kom pore. If you remove the seeds, what happens? And you try to take the weight of it. You don't get the full weight of the fruit. So don't subtract anything. And what we find if we study the Kathamrita, the Sri Sri Ramakrishna Kathamrita by Mohanananda Gupta, if we study that carefully, what you'll find is that on almost every page, Sri Ramakrishna himself is contrasting two kinds of Advaita philosophy. Again and again, he contrasts Shankara's subtraction-based Advaita philosophy from his own Vijnana Vedanta philosophy, which is an addition-based Advaita philosophy. He says that both these kinds of Advaitic philosophy are true from different spiritual standpoints, which he calls Jnana and Vijnana. Jnana pore Vijnana. Swami Balabhadranaji gave a wonderful lecture a few years ago here on the stage called Jnana pore Vijnana, Ramakrishna Vivekananda Aloy. And he was discussing my book as well, this Infinite Paths book. So, what does Sri Ramakrishna say in the Kathamrita? Sri Ramakrishna says, if you want to get to the roof, you have to climb a staircase. He likens this climbing of the staircase to the process of neti vichara in classical Advaita Vedanta, in Shankara's philosophy. Brahman is not this world, Brahman is not my body, Brahman is not my mind, and so on. And he says, finally you reach the roof. The roof signifies jnana, gyan, knowledge of non-dual Brahman, which is impersonal, attributeless, nirguna Brahman, nirvishesha Brahman. This is the ideal of Shankara's philosophy. After that process of subtraction, neti is nothing but subtraction. Brahman is not this, not this. But then Sri Ramakrishna says, after reaching the roof, there are some people who look back on that same staircase that they had just climbed and say, wait a minute, the steps are made of the same materials as the roof. Vijnani, that person is the Vijnani, the one who can climb up and down the staircase and realizes these two profound truths. Number one, Vijnani dake jini nirgun tini shogun. That divine reality which is nirguna, realized in nirvikalpa samadhi, jnana, is equally saguna. It's also the personal God. He would also say the Vijnani realized that Brahman and Shakti are non-different. Brahma Shakti abhed. Like Ugni Arta Dahika Shakti, like fire in its power to burn. And the Vijnani also sees, instead of dismissing this world as a dream, as unreal, the Vijnani sees Brahma Chatur Bingshati Tattva Hoichan. Brahman itself has become the 24 cosmic principles. So the world's not unreal. And you don't need to subtract the world from this divine truth. So according to Sri Ramakrishna, two distinct Advaitic philosophies emerge from these two different spiritual realizations. Both of them are spiritual realizations, Jnana and Vijnana. And from Jnana comes Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, a subtraction-based Advaita philosophy. And from Vijnana comes Sri Ramakrishna's own Vijnana Vedanta philosophy, which is an addition-based Advaita philosophy. Shob, Jodiye, Ekti. Now, again, the font is very small. Anyway, so if we were to encapsulate these two Advaitic philosophies in Sanskrit formulas, this is my suggestion. It's not my suggestion. Shankara's Advaita Vedanta is captured in this very famous formula, Brahma Satyam, Jagat Mithya, Jivo Brahmaheva Naparaha. We all know that. But now, how could we characterize Sri Ramakrishna's addition-based Advaita philosophy, his Vijnana Vedanta? I would suggest the following. Brahma Shaktihi Satya Jagat Satyam. Brahma Shaktihi Satya Jagat Satyam. The ultimate reality, now just compare these two different Sanskrit formulas. the ultimate reality according to Shankara is only Brahman, and he understands Brahman as Nirguna Brahman. Whereas Sri Ramakrishna understands ultimate reality as Brahma Shakti. This phrase, Brahma Shakti, is very interesting. You don't find it in the Gospel itself, in the Kathamrita. I found it in only one text, in Sri Ma Darshan, Dialogues with M, the author of the Kathamrita, but it's not found in the Kathamrita itself. He refers to the ultimate reality from Sri Ramakrishna's standpoint as Brahma Shakti. It's a beautiful expression, because the idea is the ultimate reality for Sri Ramakrishna is not just Brahman, it's equally Shakti. So this one phrase, Brahma Shakti, it encompasses both the Brahman aspect, Nirguna Brahman, and also Saguna Brahman. So Brahma Shakti is Satya. Sri Ramakrishna is not putting Shakti on a lower level than Brahman. They're equally real. And Jagat Satyam. Because Shakti is real, this world also turns out to be a real manifestation of Shakti. Does this remind us of any statements from any of the great disciples of Sri Ramakrishna? It should. Swami Turiyanandaji, one of the great monastic disciples of Sri Ramakrishna. His very last words in Bangla. Brahma Shatto, Jagat Shatto, Shabi Shatto, Shatte Pran Pratishtito. Brahman is real, everything is real. Jagat is Satya, the world is real, and Shabi Shatto, everything is real. Shatte Pran Pratishtito, life itself is grounded in truth, in reality. Swami Turiyanji, in his last words, is articulating Sri Ramakrishna's addition-based Advaita philosophy, his Vijnana Vedanta philosophy. And he does so in much greater detail, actually, in a letter, because Swami Sarvananda asked Swami Turiyanji, what exactly is Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy? And he gives this beautiful response. I might refer to it later in this presentation. I'll share some insights with you from that letter. It's a beautiful 2-page Bangla letter in response to this question, what exactly is Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy, written in 1919. So now, you might be wondering, wait a minute, there's something missing, because Shankara's Advaita Vedanta also has Jivo Brahma Vinaparaha. So Shankara's formula explains the relationship between the Jiva and non-dual Brahman. What is that relationship? It's one of absolute identity. The Jiva is none other than non-dual pure consciousness. It's a mistake to think that we're bodies and minds. We're actually non-dual pure consciousness. Now, you might ask, well, so what formula captures this aspect of Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy? How did Sri Ramakrishna conceive the relationship between the Jiva, the individual soul, and the ultimate reality, the divine? And in fact, he gives us a nice formula, repeatedly in the Kathamrita. He quotes Hanuman. Hanumanji, addressing Rama, says, I'll give you the Sanskrit, even though he quotes it in Bangla, Deha buddhya dasosmi. When I identify with the physical body, I say, O Rama, I am your servant. Jiva buddhya todam shakaha. When I identify with the Jivatma, the individual soul, I say, I am an amsha, a portion of you, O Rama. Atma buddhya tomevaham iti me nishchitamatihi. When I identify with the Supreme Soul, the Atman, then I say, I am you and you are me. Now notice the difference between this Hanuman shloka and classical Advaita Vedanta. Classical Advaita says, it affirms one, the truth of one, the ultimate truth of one relationship between Jiva and Brahman, namely absolute identity, Jivo Brahma Vinaparaha. Sri Ramakrishna embraces multiple relationships with the divine, affirming each of them to be equally real and equally valuable. He gives a beautiful example. If I have a flute, I can do a few things with that flute. I can just play one note on that flute, like that. He says, boring. Agge. Agge kya no ho. I mean, rag ragini. He wants to play ragas and raginis on that flute, using all 7 holes, relating with the divine in many different ways, sporting with the divine in all these different ways of relating. In Vaishnavism, you find these different ways. Vatsalya, Sakya, Madhurya, and so on. So Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta, his addition-based Advaita philosophy, harmonizes. This is what I want to show in detail today. It harmonizes all of the traditional Vedantic sampradayas, all of the traditional Vedantic sects, or traditions. That's why I started with this beautiful shloka, Acharyanam Mahacharyo. He was the greatest of all acharyas. He was the Samanvaya Acharya, the Acharya of harmony. He was the Samanvaya Avatara, the incarnation of harmony. Swamiji emphasized that in his letters, but less well known is that Sri Aurobindo was a great bhakta of Sri Ramakrishna. And I want to share with you a beautiful statement he made about Sri Ramakrishna in 1908 in an essay called Spirituality and Nationalism. Sri Aurobindo is discussing all the great avatars of the past, and he says, of all these souls, of all these avatars, Sri Ramakrishna was the last and greatest. For while others felt God in a single or limited aspect, Sri Ramakrishna felt him in his illimitable unity as the sum of an illimitable variety. In him, the spiritual experiences of the millions of saints who had gone before were renewed and united. He was Samanvaya Avatara. So how exactly does Sri Ramakrishna harmonize the traditional Vedantic sects? This is what I want to discuss in detail a little bit. First, what exactly is the nature of ultimate reality? According to Shankara, as we've already discussed, it's ultimately Nirguna Brahman, attributeless, impersonal, non-dual, pure consciousness. What about the Bhakti schools of Vedanta? Swami Tapasanji has a wonderful book called Bhakti Schools of Vedanta because he felt that there was an overemphasis on Shankara's Advaita and that we neglect the devotional schools of Vedanta, so he devoted a whole book to it. So in that book you'll find that he explains this in detail. He says that Ramanuja school of Vishishtadvaita Vedanta and Madhva school of Dvaita Vedanta, or sometimes called Madhva Vedanta, they conceive ultimate reality as the opposite, Saguna Brahman, opposite of Shankara. It's Saguna Brahman, Vishnu. But there are other Vedantic schools which are less well known. Achintya Bheda Veda, which was inspired by Chaitanya, the Vaishnava school, Gaudiya Vaishnavism we say, and the Shuddhadvaita Vedanta school of Vallabhacharya. These are schools based on devotion toward Krishna. So they take ultimate reality to be Krishna, personal God. But unlike Ramanuja and Madhva, these two schools, Achintya Bheda Bheda and Shuddhadvaita, they don't deny the reality of Nirguna Brahman. They accept it. But they put Nirguna Brahman on a lower footing. They make it less valuable than Saguna Brahman, Krishna. For instance, in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, in Achintya Bheda Bheda, what you find is they say that Brahman is the Tanubha of Krishna. Tanubha means, it can be translated in many ways. Tapasanji translates it as peripheral brilliance. Nirguna Brahman, which is supposed to be the highest according to Shankara's school, is actually just the peripheral brilliance of Krishna himself. It's just a minor aspect. And Vallabhacharya says something similar using a different metaphor. He says that Brahman, Nirguna Brahman, is just the foot, the charanam of Krishna. Again, you see this kind of hierarchy. The language is always hierarchical. They're putting Saguna Brahman above Nirguna Brahman, but they're both equally real, unlike Ramanuja's school and Madhva's school. Now we can appreciate what's so distinctive about Sri Ramakrishna's harmonizing philosophy. What does Sri Ramakrishna say? Brahma Shakti Abhed. Jemon Agni Artha Dahika Shakti. Shap Artha Tijjog Goti. The same snake, whether coiled up, stationary, or moving around. It's the same snake either way, in its static aspect or in its dynamic aspect. Fire and its power to burn. The same truth, seen from different standpoints. So now, how do we relate Sri Ramakrishna's approach to ultimate reality with these traditional schools? Well, he turns to Shankara and he says, you're right, ultimate reality is Nirguna. But don't limit the ultimate to just Nirguna Brahman. Bhagavana kono iti nai. This is one of Sri Ramakrishna's most repeated teachings and most important teachings. Don't limit the absolute to just Nirguna Brahman. And then he turns to Ramanuja and Madhva and he says, yes, the ultimate reality is Saguna Brahman. It is Vishnu. I love Vishnu. But don't limit the ultimate to just Vishnu. Why only Vishnu? Why not also Christ? Why not Allah? Why not Nirguna Brahman also? And then he turns to the Achintya Bheda Vedavadins and the Shuddhadvaita Vedantins, and he says, it's very good that you accept the reality of both Nirguna Brahman and Saguna Brahman, Krishna and Nirguna Brahman. But why go into these hierarchies? Higher, lower. We don't need to. It's not about a matter of higher and lower, one being higher or better or more supreme than the other, one major, one minor, and so on. It's a matter of temperament and preference, whether we prefer Brahman, Nirguna Brahman, or Shakti. And Shakti herself manifests in many forms. There's so many devas and devis. What is it? It depends on our purva janma samskaras. There's no higher and lower there. So Sri Ramakrishna, unlike all of the traditional Vedantic schools, he affirms not only the equal reality of both Nirguna Brahman and Saguna Brahman, but their equal value, which you don't find, as far as I can tell, in any of the traditional Vedantic schools. This is the newness that you find in Sri Ramakrishna, the Samanvaya Avatara of our age. Second big question: what exactly is the status of this world? So we know, of course, that Shankara's view is Jagat Mithya. Ultimately, it's an illusion. It doesn't exist. Ajatavada, we'll talk about that a little later. And we know that bhakti schools do not say that this world is unreal. They say it's a real, but it has a real but temporary existence. And it has no independent existence apart from God. Okay? What is Sri Ramakrishna's view? Well, fortunately, on December 16th, 1883, we find in the Kathamrita, M asks Sri Ramakrishna this question, point blank. He says, Jagat ki mitha. What is Sri Ramakrishna's answer? Mitha keno? O shab bicharer kotha. Prathandra neti neti bichar korbar shomoy tini jeev non, jagat non, choturbinshi tattva non hoye jay. Eshob স্বপ্নবৎ হয়ে যায় তারপর অনুলোম বিলোম তখন তিনি জীব জগৎ হয়েছেন বোধ হয়. He goes on like that, explaining the staircase metaphor. Then he says again, just a little bit later, জগৎ মিথ্যা কেন হবে? ওসব বিচারের কথা. Notice how he's contrasting this vichara marga, this neti kind of vichara of classical Advaita Vedanta, subtraction-based Advaita, with his own standpoint, which is an addition-based Vijnana Vedanta kind of Advaita philosophy. He says, ওসব বিচারের কথা. তাকে দর্শন হলে তখন বোঝা যায় যে তিনি জীব জগৎ হয়েছেন. What is that? That is the standpoint of the Vijnani. He's contrasting the subtraction-based vichara of classical Advaita Vedanta with his own addition-based Vijnana Vedanta. তারপর বলছেন, referring to his own spiritual experience of Vijnana, he says, আমায় মা কালী ঘরে দেখিয়ে দিলেন যে মাই সব হয়েছেন. দেখিয়ে দিলেন সব চিন্ময়, প্রতিমা চিন্ময়, বেদী চিন্ময়, কোষাকুষি চিন্ময়, চৌকাট চিন্ময়, মার্বেলের পাথর সব চিন্ময়. ঘরের ভিতর দেখি সব যেন রসে রয়েছে, সচ্চিদানন্দ রসে. This is Vijnana Vedanta. This is the spiritual experience of Vijnana, which recognizes all names and forms themselves as real manifestations of Shakti. So Sri Ramakrishna actually says, very explicitly, that this is a different kind of Advaita philosophy. Where does he say it? This is also from the Kathamrita. February 25th, 1885. He says, Bhaktaro ekakar gyan hoy. Even bhaktas have a realization of oneness, ekakar. সে দেখে ঈশ্বর ছাড়া আর কিছুই নাই. স্বপ্নবোধ বলে না, তবে বলে তিনিই সব হয়েছেন. মোমের বাগানে সবই মোম, তবে নানা রূপ. It's a beautiful metaphor. Wax. It's as if everything is made of wax. What's the philosophical significance of using this wax metaphor? It means that the names and forms themselves are real manifestations. And look how beautifully it dovetails with the Upanishads. In the Chandaka Upanishad, when the question is raised, how does Brahman relate to this world of names and forms? The answer is, like we have formless clay being shaped into different kinds of pots. Like we have molten gold that's shaped by the goldsmith into golden earrings, golden bracelets, golden necklace. He's using a very similar metaphor. So this wax metaphor helps us to arrive at a better and deeper and truer interpretation of the Vedantic scriptures. That's also something that's extremely important, which Swami Vivekananda used to emphasize. Another big question. This is all philosophy so far, but what about spiritual practice? What do the traditional Vedantic schools say about spiritual practice? They usually have a hierarchy of yogas. So, of course, according to Shankara school, the only direct path to moksha, liberation, is Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge. According to bhakti schools, obviously, the highest yoga is bhakti yoga, the path of devotion. And bhaktas will put the path of devotion over other paths, like the path of knowledge. And so they've been fighting with each other for centuries, which is higher, which is lower, and so on. What does Sri Ramakrishna say? Kautamrita. Innumerable are the ways that lead to God. There are the paths of jnana, of karma, and of bhakti. If you are sincere, you will attain God in the end, whichever path you follow. And in other places in the Kautamrita, you also find him mentioning Raja Yoga as a direct and independent path. So all four of the yogas are direct and independent paths to liberation, no higher and lower. Totally different from all of the traditional Vedantic schools. And Swami Vivekananda, following his guru, says the following very explicitly. Each one of our yogas is fitted to make man perfect even without the help of the others, because they have all the same goal in view. The yogas of work, karma yoga, of wisdom, jnana yoga, and of devotion, bhakti yoga, are all capable of serving as direct and independent means for the attainment of moksha. That's why this is a samanvaya darshana. This is a harmonizing philosophy. Puts all the yogas on an equal footing. Another big question, the fourth theme that I want to discuss. How exactly should we look upon other spiritual traditions and other religions? So what will help us is, oh, sorry, I didn't show this slide, but anyway, I read it out. So this is the slide that I want to discuss. Alan Race, a Christian theologian, he came up with this, what's called a threefold typology of attitudes toward other religions, which has become very famous and which is used all the time. I discuss it in my work as well. He introduced this framework in 1983, and he uses these three terms. He distinguishes exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism. What do these mean? Exclusivism is the view that only my religion leads to the highest salvation. Other religions don't. So it's the most kind of, you can say, dogmatic view. My religion alone is effective, other religions are not at all effective. Inclusivism is a kind of middle position. Inclusivism is a view that only one religion, my religion of course, leads directly to salvation. But other religions lead somehow indirectly, more slowly, to the same goal, or maybe sometimes these other religions lead to a lesser kind of salvation. It distinguishes different kinds of salvations, higher and lower, and says, my religion leads to the highest salvation, yours leads to a kind of inferior kind of salvation. They're different, so these kinds of inclusivism you'll find in different forms. One example, the great Catholic theologian, Karl Rahner, R-A-H-N-E-R. He says, non-Christians, they'll also get saved, but indirectly, because they are all anonymous Christians. He came up with this phrase, anonymous Christians. Hindus are anonymous Christians. Muslims, anonymous Christians. Jewish people, anonymous Christians. Buddhists, anonymous Christians. But it's better to be a conscious Christian, right? You can get to the goal faster. There's always a higher and lower kind of hierarchical kind of language in play. And on the Indian side, what I want to suggest is that Shankara's school of Advaita Vedanta is a form of inclusivism. Okay? And we'll see why in a second. Because he puts the goal of realization of Nirguna Brahman above other forms of salvation, theistic forms of liberation. But finally, we have this third paradigm called religious pluralism. What is pluralism? Pluralism is a view that more than one religion, not just my religion, but also your religion, is equally capable of leading to the highest goal. No higher and lower. My religion takes me to the highest, your religion will also take you to the highest. This is, my argument is that Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy is based on religious pluralism, and I want to show that in some detail. He doesn't go into these hierarchies of higher and lower. So to help us appreciate what's so radical in Sri Ramakrishna's religious pluralism, let's first see in what way classical Advaita Vedanta is more inclusivist than pluralist. This is something, by the way, this mountain metaphor is one that Swami Tapasanandaji himself uses in the introduction to his book, Bhakti Schools of Vedanta. And he has a section called The Patronizing Attitude of Advaita Vedanta. I recommend that you look at it. So he says that Advaitans are like they're standing at the peak of Mount Everest, looking down at the base camp and saying, you Bhaktas are good too. Patronizing. So let's see how that works. Christians, through the path of Christianity, realize the Christian God. But notice, They're out of luck. They haven't reached the top of the mountain. What about Muslims? I'm just giving some examples. Through Islam, what do they reach? They realize Allah, but too bad, not the peak of the mountain. Theistic Hindus, meaning Hindus who believe in the personal God, through their respective paths, Vaishnavism and so on, what do they reach? They realize different forms of the personal God, but out of luck, not the peak. What do they have to do to reach the peak, according to Shankara's school? The Christians need to stop practicing Christianity. Practice Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, and where do you end up? You get to the peak. Wonderful. Same thing with Muslims. Stop practicing Islam. Not going to get you anywhere past this point. And practice Jnana Yoga instead. And then you reach that highest peak, which is realization of Nirguna Brahman. You have to transcend Saguna Brahman. Same thing with theistic Hindus. Stop practicing your theistic religion, your japa, your prayer, and so on. It'll just keep you stuck at that level. Instead, practice the path of knowledge, and you reach the peak. Okay. Now, by contrast, now I think we can really appreciate what's so different and radical and harmonizing about Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta. Here's how I see Sri Ramakrishna harmonizing the world religions in a pluralistic manner. Christians, through the practice of Christianity, directly reach the peak. Which is what? What is that peak? This is important. He says the peak is the realization of the divine in any form or aspect, either as Nirguna Brahman or as Shakti. And Shakti can be realized as Christ or as Allah or as Krishna or as Ganesha and so on. There's no limit. Muslims, through the practice of Islam, directly reach the peak, which for them is realization of Allah. Hindus also reach the same peak through their respective paths. Advaita Vedantins also reach the peak. But for Advaitins, the peak is realization of Nirguna Brahman. So that peak is actually, it means different things to different practitioners, but you can, the common denominator is that all of them realize the same divine in different forms and aspects. And Buddhists, why not? They can also reach the same peak. Actually, let's pause on that. Yeah. So now, how does Sri Ramakrishna arrive at this beautiful harmonizing religious pluralism? On the basis of Vijnana. Because it's as a Vijnani that he realized God in so many different aspects. He used to say, I am a glutton in the spiritual field. You eat, you're full, but you're not satisfied. You're going to eat a second meal and a third meal, and you're still not satisfied. Then a 10th meal and a 15th meal. He was a glutton in the spiritual field. He couldn't get enough. So what does it mean? He realized God as Mother Kali, but he wasn't satisfied. So then he ended up realizing that same Mother Kali, but in so many different aspects and forms. And he realized even God as Allah, as Christ. He realized Nirguna Brahman when he was doing Advaitic sadhana under Totapuri. And he realized Hanuman and Ganesha and so on. Not necessarily Ganesha, but Hanuman and Sita and so on. Radha, Krishna. And then, on the basis of these various realizations, and especially the realization of Vijnana, he said, and this is my favorite formulation of his religious pluralism, Tini onanto, potho onanto. Because the divine is onanto, infinite, the paths are also infinite. Such a powerful and profound teaching. Because the divine is infinite, therefore there are infinite paths to the divine. That's why I called the book Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality. One of the analogies or parables that he used to explain religious pluralism was the parable of the chameleon, Bohurupi. Gache bosheche. This chameleon's on a tree. One person goes and sees it as green, comes back to his friends and says, you got to check out this green chameleon. It's really cool. And then the second guy goes to the same tree, sees a red chameleon, comes back and starts arguing with his friend. Hey, I saw a red chameleon. Why are you pulling my chain? In America, there's an expression, pulling my chain. Why are you joking with me? Okay. Another person goes, blue chameleon. And they start fighting with each other. Then what happens? There's a person, an unusual person, what in the U.S. is called a tree sitter. There are these tree activists who like kind of protect trees. You know, they don't want them to be cut down. So there are people who actually sit on the trees so that the people don't cut them down. So there's somebody there who lives in this tree, a human being who lives in this tree, 24 hours a day, and he says, stop your fighting. I live under this tree. And I know that all of you are right, because it's a chameleon and it changes colors. Sometimes it's red, sometimes green, sometimes blue, sometimes colorless. Now, what are the morals of this parable? Well, first, the different colors of the chameleon, the Bahurupi, correspond to different forms of the personal God. Christ, Krishna, Ganesha, and so on. Second, the colorless chameleon corresponds to Nirguna Brahman, the highest according to Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. But notice that in the parable, the colorless chameleon is not somehow truer or more real than the yellow chameleon or the red chameleon. They're on an equal footing. That's Sri Ramakrishna's religious pluralism. And fourth, this is not just a kind of dogmatic assertion. It's not just an intellectual hypothesis. It's grounded in his own experiential realization of Vijnana. Who represents the Vijnani in this chameleon parable? The person sitting under the tree. This is the realized soul who has not just realized the divine in one aspect, but in multiple aspects. You see the same divine chameleon as green and red and yellow and colorless and so on. Another big question that all of these different schools of Vedanta ask: what is the nature of ultimate liberation? Moksha. What does it look like? Shankara, it's what Sri Ramakrishna calls becoming sugar. You merge your individuality in non-dual pure consciousness. And his example is, imagine a salt doll, nunet putul, shomudrum aptegeche. It goes to measure the depth of the ocean. But the moment it sets foot in the ocean, what happens? It melts into the ocean, golejai. It becomes one with Brahman. That's the highest goal, according to Shankara's school. And what does Shankara and his school say? What do they say about the heaven of devotional schools? Christian heaven, the Islamic heaven called Jannah, the various lokas that you find in bhakti schools within Hinduism. What does Shankara say about it? He says that they're not eternal. They're temporary. They can be very long periods of time, Brahma Loka, he says, but you can't stay there eternally. Ultimately, the only eternal liberation is merging your individuality in non-dual pure consciousness. And of course, bhakti schools, devotional schools, they say the opposite. The true liberation is residing in an eternal heaven, a loka, an eternal supraphysical realm, in loving communion with the personal God. This is what Sri Ramakrishna says is chini hote chai na khete chai, eating sugar. So the theistic ideal of liberation is captured by eating sugar. The Advaitic, the classical Advaitic ideal of liberation is captured in what Sri Ramakrishna says is becoming sugar. But now the interesting thing about Sri Ramakrishna is he equally accepts both. He doesn't place either becoming sugar over eating sugar or eating sugar above becoming sugar. And this is a big difference from the traditional schools. That's why he's the Samanvaya Acharya and Mahacharyo, Acharyana Mahacharyo, because he beautifully harmonizes the more one-sided perspectives of the different traditional Vedantic sampradayas. And so I like to think about Sri Ramakrishna's understanding of liberation as a kind of many-roomed mansion, a metaphor used by Jesus as well, a many-roomed mansion. Imagine a vast building, house, with hundreds of rooms. Each one of those rooms represents a different state of liberation, a different form of liberation. Some people, we tend to assume that liberation has to be the same for everybody. Why? Scholars say that's a monolithic understanding of liberation. Why should we? Why shouldn't there be multiple forms of liberation for different people? Why force everybody to experience the same kind of liberation? So Sri Ramakrishna says, what form the state of liberation takes depends on your individual preferences and temperament, what kind of sadhana you've engaged in the course of many lifetimes, and so on. But there's no higher and lower. They're all equally true. How do we know this? He presents a beautiful analogy of an infinite ocean of Satchit Ananda. And he says, imagine that because of the gentle breeze of bhakti, this water forms into ice, borof, in different places. Each of those forms of ice corresponds to different forms of the personal God, Saguna Brahman. One might be the Christ iceberg, another one is the Ganesha, and so on. Then he says, with the rising of the sun of knowledge, Gyan Shurjo, ki hai? Gole jai. All these ice forms melt. Now, if he stopped there, he would be vindicating Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. He would be supporting classical Advaita, because the ice forms melt, which suggests that Saguna Brahman is a lower truth than Nirguna Brahman. But his parable doesn't stop there. He says, Kintu kayak jaigai, borofta golena. The ice doesn't melt at all. Nitya Shakar. Nitya Sakara. What an extraordinary statement. Nitya Shakar. eternal forms of the personal God. This is not accepted by classical Advaita Vedanta at all. But Sri Ramakrishna affirms it, not as a hypothesis, but because he realized it. He realized the truth of these eternal forms of the divine, which never melt. So what is he doing? He's placing the theistic ideal of an eternal heaven on the same footing as the classical Advaitic ideal of becoming one with non-dual pure consciousness. He's the first to do this. It's remarkable. And we should appreciate that. If we're really followers of Sri Ramakrishna, let's resist the temptation to keep stuffing him into these different boxes. He was either an Advaitin or a Vishishtadvaita or... He's a new avatara. He's teaching us this grand harmonizing philosophy. Let's try to appreciate it. So I mentioned earlier that if you really deeply try to grasp Sri Ramakrishna's harmonizing philosophy, it can also shed greater light on the Vedantic scriptures. It sheds new light on the Vedantic scriptures. Who says this? Swami Vivekananda. He says it again and again. He says, instead of blindly relying on any of the traditional commentators, we should reinterpret the Vedantic scriptures in the light of the life and teachings of Sri Ramakrishna. We've only begun to do this. Most of the work has not yet been done. What has been done? I'll mention a couple things, some nice books. One is Swami Tapasanandaji's book on the Bhagavad Gita, the scripture of mankind. It's not a full commentary, unfortunately. It's not a full bhashya on the Gita. What it is he gives beautiful notes on what he considers to be the most important verses, shlokas of the Gita. And he often brings in Sri Ramakrishna. So that's one of the texts I use when I teach Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. Another nice text, which is less well known, is Swami Harshanandaji's Sanskrit commentary on the Isha Upanishad, called Viveka Sukha Vardhini. Viveka Sukha Vardhini. And Swami Nityastanandaji, the head of our Basavaragudi Bangalore Mutt, he translated Harshanandaji's Sanskrit commentary, thankfully, for those of us who don't know Sanskrit well, into English. And Chennai Mutt has produced a bilingual edition of Harshanandaji's commentary. So on facing page, one side is the Sanskrit original, and on the other side you get the English translation. It's a beautiful little book. A reinterpretation of the Isha Upanishad from the standpoint of Sri Ramakrishna. But see, that's it. We don't have much more than that so far. We don't have a Brahma Sutra Bhashya from the standpoint of Sri Ramakrishna. We don't have a full commentary on the Bhagavad Gita in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. Most of the Upanishads are lacking commentaries in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. So that's part of what I would like to do, God willing. A full Prasthanatraya Bhashya, starting with the Gita, then going to the major Upanishads, and then Brahma Sutra. I want to just give you a couple examples. I already mentioned how we get a new understanding of this clay and pots metaphor, gold and golden ornaments from the Chandogya Upanishad, if we interpret them from the standpoint of Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta. But let me give you some other examples. Bhagavad Gita, very quickly. You'll find the terms Jnana and Vijnana paired in several places in the Bhagavad Gita, especially 7.2 and 9.1. Jnana and Vijnana. And it's mysterious because Krishna doesn't define the terms. So different commentators interpret them in different ways. Shankara gives what is the most common interpretation. Jnana means intellectual realization, intellectual understanding of the Atman. Vijnana is experiential realization of the same Atman. So it's a difference between intellectual understanding and spiritual realization. Most people understand, when they read the Gita, they see Jnana and Vijnana, they tend to interpret it in that way. Not Swami Tapasanji, for instance. He has a beautiful interpretation of Jnana and Vijnana in these verses, and he says, you cannot properly understand the meaning of Jnana and Vijnana without Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on Vijnana. Jnana should be understood in Sri Ramakrishna's sense as the realization, the spiritual realization of non-dual Brahman. And Vijnana is what Sri Ramakrishna calls Vijnana, the spiritual realization of Brahma Shakti, manifesting as this entire universe. And he gives scriptural proof. Vasudeva sarvam iti samahatma sudurlabhaha. The realized soul sees that Vasudeva is everything. This is the Vijnani's realization. Now, I'm an academic philosopher, and one of the main things that philosophers do is they address objections. And so since the publication of my book on Sri Ramakrishna in 2018, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, I've gotten lots of objections, some of them scholarly and academic. There was a whole book symposium published with 13 different scholars writing responses to the book, and I wrote a final response. It's published in the International Journal of Hindu Studies. But I'm not going to discuss all that. That becomes very technical, dry. You might put you to sleep. If you're not already asleep, I hope not. So what I want to discuss is something more relevant to bhaktas, devotees, followers of the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition. I've heard many objections from devotees, simple devotees, non-academics. And I want to address some of them. I haven't really in the past. I would like to today, if you allow me. Well, one of the most common objections I hear from just ordinary people is my interpretation of Shankara is wrong. Say I'm way off in claiming that Shankara taught that this world is an illusion or unreal. Wrong. That's the wrong way to interpret Jagat Mithya. Okay, then the question is, well, how should we interpret Jagat Mithya? What these people say, what these objectors say, it varies. Some of them say, no, Mithya doesn't mean unreal, doesn't mean illusory. It means the world only has dependent existence. I've heard this many, many times. But what did I say earlier? Bhakti schools of Vedanta say that this world has dependent existence on God. Is there really no difference between what Shankara said about the world and what Ramanuja and what Madhva said? No. Nobody says, none of the Vedantins say that this world has independent existence. It's a silly idea. Materialists might argue for that position, but no Vedantin will say that of any stripe. What distinguishes Shankara's Advaita Vedanta from the Bhakti schools is that the world does not merely have dependent existence, it doesn't exist from the ultimate standpoint. How do I know that? We need to understand Shankara's overarching metaphysical framework of adhyasa, illusory superimposition. The only truth is non-dual pure consciousness, Brahman. Why don't we see Brahman? Because of adhyasa, because we mistakenly superimpose upon that truth of Brahman various upadhis, limiting adjuncts, different things. That's why I see you in front of me. That's why I see chairs. That's why I see a laptop. I don't see Brahman. I'm mistakenly superimposing all these different names and forms onto the real truth. What's the example? All of you know this. Rajju Sarpa. Advaitins love ropes and snakes. The only truth is a rope. But from a distance, it looks like a snake to me, and I get frightened. And then I get closer and closer, and I say, oh, I see the snake was a rope all along. Was there ever a snake? Is it right to say that, no, the snake is not unreal. It just has dependent existence on the rope. It just doesn't exist. It never existed. It's not that it once existed, then it disappeared back into the rope. It just never was. Never was, never is, never will be. That is exactly how Shankara understands this world of names and forms, Jagat Mithya. How do we know this? Well, because he says again and again, this entire world of Nama-rupa is avidya kalpita. This is the term he uses all the time. This entire realm of names and forms is conjured up by avidya, by ignorance. It only exists because we're ignorant of the highest truth of Brahman. And that's why from the ultimate standpoint, Shankara agrees with Gaudapada, ajata is the ultimate truth of Advaita Vedanta. What is ajata? It means none of this ever existed. Nanirodho na chotpattid, nabaddho na sadhakaha, namukshudna vai mukta ityesha paramatata. From the ultimate standpoint, there is no universe, there's no creation, no dissolution, no sadhaka, no unbound, nobody liberated. That is the ultimate standpoint of Advaita Vedanta. And you'll find it constantly in the bhashyas. And that Rajju Sarpa, the rope snake analogy, helps us to see that. Another common objection I get, you're wrong to say that Shankara put bhakti, devotion, on a lower footing than jnana. Why? Because he composed so many beautiful devotional hymns. Bhaja Govindam, not with my beautiful voice, but anyway, people who can actually sing that. Bhaja Govindam and so on, devotional hymns. So how could he put bhakti on a lower footing? Okay, a couple of responses to this. First of all, scholars tend to think that he was not the author of these devotional hymns. What's the evidence for that? If you look at the literary style of the compositions, you find that it's very different from the kind of poetry that we know he composed. What is that? The poetic portion of the Upadesha Sastri, written in a very, very different poetic style. That's one reason. But even thematically, the ideas are so different from what you find in his bhashyas, which we know he wrote. So if there's a contradiction, you go with what's more reliable. You go with the bhashyas. right? Okay, so the first line of response is he probably wasn't the author of these devotional hymns. But now, I don't want to stop there, because maybe he did write these devotional hymns. That's possible. Even if he did, there are two problems. Maybe he wrote these devotional hymns from the Vyavaharika standpoint for the likes of us dummies, Manda Adhikaris, he would call them. People who have impure minds, who are only fit to practice Bhakti Yoga. He's giving us encouragement. See, you guys are very, very good. Bhakti is great. Because we're at that level, we're at that lower level. So it's also possible that he composed, if he did compose these devotional hymns, he did it for these inferior spiritual aspirants who have impure minds and who are only qualified for Bhakti Yoga. And he's praising Bhakti so highly to make us feel good. If he keeps putting Bhakti down, we won't have any incentive to practice devotion, right? And we'll never purify our minds. Now there's another response. Another thing, even if he did compose these hymns, we still got a big problem on our hands. What's that problem? We know he wrote the Prasthanatraya Bhashya. We know he wrote commentaries on the Brahma Sutra, on the Bhagavad Gita, on many of the Upanishads. What does he say about Bhakti there? Well, let me give you one example. This is what he says about the personal God, Ishvara, in Brahma Sutra, Bhashya 2.1.14. You can look it up. He says, Ishvara's rulership, omniscience, and omnipotence, Ishvarasya, Ishvaratvam, Sarvagyatam, Sarvashaktitvam, are dependent on the upadhis, the limiting adjuncts conjured up by ignorance. But from the ultimate standpoint, such terms as the ruler, the ruled, omniscience, etc., cannot be used with regard to the Atman, the non-dual Atman, shining in its own nature after the removal of all limiting adjuncts through knowledge. This is very technical, but it's a very simple idea. The very idea of a personal God is a result of mistakenly superimposing upon non-dual, impersonal Brahman the attributes of the personal God. What are those attributes? Omnipotence, omniscience, and so on. But they're not true from the ultimate standpoint. That's why when we realize Brahman, all those upadhis vanish. And what's left? No more personal God. What's left is non-dual, pure consciousness. Another common objection I hear from devotees. No, but Shankara also says all the time that everything is Brahman. That's true. You're right. Everything is Brahman, but in what sense? He explains it. Let's look at what Shankara himself says. This is from his commentary on Brahma Sutra 1.3.1, which you can also look up. He says, yes, Chandogya Upanishad says, Sarvam Kalividam Brahma, one of the most famous mantras in all of the Upanishads. Everything is indeed Brahman. How should we understand that if we follow classical Advaita Vedanta? He says very, very precisely, the purpose of this statement that everything is Brahman is prapancha pravilapanartham. That's the original Sanskrit. To dissolve this universe. Remember subtraction. Subtract all the names and forms from this world, and what's left is a substratum, non-dual Brahman. Get rid of the names and forms of chairs and people and dogs and trees. What's left? The same non-dual Brahman. That's his subtractive method. That's his subtractive interpretation of Sarvam Kalividam Brahma. Now, by contrast, how does Sri Ramakrishna, how would he interpret, how can we interpret Sarvam Kalividam Brahma from the standpoint of Sri Ramakrishna? It's an addition-based Advaita. All the names and forms themselves are Brahman. We don't need to subtract anything. And some of you might be familiar with a book by Satish Chandra Chatterjee called Classical Indian Philosophies. Their synthesis in the philosophy of Sri Ramakrishna. It's a wonderful book, and in the last chapter, he shows how Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta philosophy, he doesn't use the term, but this philosophy of Sri Ramakrishna, how it harmonizes all of the different Vedantic sampradayas. And there, he says, he contrasts Shankara's understanding of Sarvam Kalividam Brahma, which is a subtraction-based kind of Advaita, from Sri Ramakrishna's. And he says, for Sri Ramakrishna, you don't have to subtract anything. All the names and forms themselves, like wax, everything is made of wax. Everything is Brahman. I said that I would mention Turiyanji, so I'll just mention it quickly. From that letter from 1919, Swami Turiyanji says, explaining Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy, this is the difference between Shankara's Advaita and Sri Ramakrishna's. Turiyanji himself says this. Everything is God. God is everything in the universe. All names and forms come from Him and are in God. Waves, foam, bubbles. All these are nothing but water. I don't care if this position agrees with your Vivartavada. This is a very interesting statement. Sarvanandaji was a scholar of Shankara. And he's asking this question, what was Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy? Turiyanji. Shabi to tini shab, namrup to tateke ebong tate, torongo, fen, budbud, jol chara to kichui na. Ete toma vivartavad thaka jak. I don't care whether this agrees with your Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. What is Vivartavada? That is Shankara's doctrine of this world as an illusory appearance. Like the snake is an illusory appearance of the rope, this whole world of names and forms is a Vivarta, an illusory appearance of Brahman. And Sarvananda says, I don't really think that Sri Ramakrishna accepts Vivartavada. It doesn't seem like he does. Turayana says, who cares? He's teaching a different kind of Advaita philosophy. It's not based on Vivartavada. He sees everything as a real manifestation of the divine. Another common objection I get from devotees sometimes, they say, you're creating a new sect, this new sampradaya. Vijnana Vedanta, you give this new name, the shiny name with the nice VV. It's called alliteration in literature, which means you get that V twice. So it rolls off the tongue. But you're creating a new sampradaya. How dare you? Sri Ramakrishna, if we really worship him as an avatara, and as a Samanvaya avatara, the greatest avatara of our age, the greatest of all avatars, as Swamiji said, as Sri Aurobindo said, why are we not allowing him to give us a new message? Why are we always trying to fit him into these traditional boxes? It's very, very strange, this phenomenon. Let's try to let Sri Ramakrishna speak for himself. And let's remember, Vedanta is not a static, it's not a frozen tradition that's stuck in the past. It's constantly evolving. It's constantly changing based on new realizations, new insights. Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda, Sri Aurobindo, and others, Ramdas, Papa Ramdas, many others, they're continuing this great Vedantic tradition and developing it further. Sri Ramakrishna taught a new addition-based Advaita philosophy. That's what I'm trying to point out here. So it's better not to try to force Sri Ramakrishna's teachings into any of these sampradayas, in any of these boxes. And so what exactly is Vijnana Vedanta? Is that not another kind of box, the Vijnana Vedanta box? No, it's what Swami Vivekananda called a non-sectarian sect. It's a very paradoxical expression. Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta is a non-sectarian sect. It's a sect because it has very concrete doctrines. And you can point out, see, Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine that Brahman and Shakti are abhed, it encompasses Shankara's view of Nirguna Brahman and also the theistic views of Saguna Brahman. See, but it beautifully harmonizes them. But it's non-sectarian, unlike the traditional sampradayas, which are more one-sided. So finally, I skipped some things because I was running out of time. Sorry, I should have really... Okay. I wanted to mention that so far I've written 2 out of the 3 books of what I call my Integral Advaita Trilogy. I'm developing an extended argument that Sri Ramakrishna and his disciple Swami Vivekananda, and more surprisingly maybe to some of you, Sri Aurobindo, developed a new school of Advaita within the Vedantic tradition. You can call it by many names, and the name isn't really important. That's why, like I called Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy Vijnana Vedanta, but you can also call it Integral Advaita. Why integral? Integral means all-encompassing. And that's exactly what Sri Ramakrishna said, Shab Jodiya Ekti. This is why Integral Advaita. So they're developing a new school of Integral Advaita within the tradition of Vedanta, which doesn't mean that they all taught exactly the same thing. There might be some differences, but in that same broader Integral Advaita tradition, that is an addition-based Advaita Vedanta. And I wanted to conclude on this note. I really believe that our tradition is still in its infancy. It's a young tradition. Sri Ramakrishna left his body in 1886, 150 years ago, about less. It's a very young tradition. Young in what sense? Look at Christianity. From 0 to now, 2026, how much it developed. And go back to the first few centuries of Christianity. There's a beautiful book, very dense and scholarly, written by an Oxford professor named Jarman McCullough, called History of Christianity. And he focuses on these first few centuries. And he said, in these first few centuries after Christ, everything was up for grabs. All sorts of ideas were being floated. Gnosticism, it's a very interesting view. Christ, even though we think that he's crucified, he wasn't crucified. It's almost like Advaita Vedanta. He was not crucified. And so many things. This world is an illusion. That's also part of Gnosticism. And there are so many doctrines. There was no single orthodox Christianity at the time until centuries later. And even that orthodoxy changes in the course of centuries. Now, where are we in the context of the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition? We're in our infancy. Just imagine, go back to 125 CE, Common Era. Where was Christianity then? That's more or less where we are now. So I believe that hundreds of years from now, 500 years from now, 1,000 years from now, historians will be writing the history of the Ramakrishna tradition. And to date, from 1886 to 2026, we can divide the history of the Ramakrishna movement so far, to date, into 3 phases. Phase 1, like Christianity, the early history of Christianity, different people are interpreting Sri Ramakrishna in many different ways. You find some people interpreting him as a Shakta, some as a Vaishnava, some as a classical Advaitin, some as, and so on. Christian, Quaker, Mishra. There's a beautiful, there's a really nice Gautamrita entry where the Christian Quaker, Mishra, sees Christ in Sri Ramakrishna. So everybody's seeing him in his own way and her own way. That was the first phase. This is something that you have to read the Gautamrita very carefully, but Sri Ma, the author, he doesn't think that Sri Ramakrishna was a follower of Shankara. He says it in a passage called Shebak Hridaya. He says, Sri Ramakrishna was not a Mayavadi. Karan uni jagat ko uriye denni, mitha bodenni. He was a follower of Ramanuja. It's very interesting. Sri Ma himself believed that Sri Ramakrishna was a follower of Ramanuja. Now, you don't have to accept it, but my point is this. The direct disciples, the earliest disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, interpreted Sri Ramakrishna in many different ways. Okay. Turiyananji, as we've already seen also, differently. Now, that's phase 1. But then, phase 1 is quickly overtaken by what I would call phase 2, which has dominated ever since. This is what I call the Shankara phase in the history of the Ramakrishna movement. The overwhelming tendency has been to interpret Sri Ramakrishna through the lens of Shankaracharya's subtraction-based Advaita philosophy. Gambirananda's works, Gambiranandaji, Omkaranandaji, Dhireshanandaji, Madhavanandaji, and the list goes on and on and on, with one exception, one striking, luminous exception, Swami Tapasanandaji. If you study Bhakti schools of Vedanta carefully, if you look at another one of his books called Man, God, and World in Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy, you're going to find that he's one of the outliers. He's a renegade, a philosophical renegade, in really emphasizing Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta, a kind of more harmonizing philosophy. But in general, by and large, what you find is we're still stuck in phase 2. This kind of, we're not letting Sri Ramakrishna speak for himself. We're always trying to fit him into this Shankara box. Now, what I am following in the wake of the great work of Swami Tapasanandaji and other scholars like Satish Chandra Chatterjee, I am trying to usher in phase 3. What do we call phase 3? I would say back to Sri Ramakrishna. Let's come back to Sri Ramakrishna. Swami Vivekananda used to say, যে কোনো একটা ঠাকুরের উপদেশ নিয়ে ঝুড়ি ঝুড়ি দর্শন গ্রন্থ লেখা যায়. You can write baskets full of philosophical treatises on any one of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. Where are we? What have we done so far? We're still stuck in phase 2. We haven't even begun to analyze deeply Sri Ramakrishna's philosophical teachings. What does he mean by Brahma Shakti Abid? What does he mean by Vijnana and Jnana and so on and so forth? All these amazing teachings, eating sugar, becoming sugar. So we need to begin to let Sri Ramakrishna speak in his own voice. And we also need to learn how to listen properly. Listen to what he's saying without superimposing our own ideas, our own preconceived frameworks. Let's try to let Sri Ramakrishna speak for himself, and let's listen to him with humility, with reverence, and with an open mind and heart. Thank you. Hari Om Tat Sat. Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.